I have to say, I think that Pokemon is highly overrated. As somebody who's played maybe 3 or 4 generations total out of the God knows how many they even have now, don't quote me, I don't fucking know. I haven't followed the last, I think, 4. So, anyways, we're just gonna say that my interest in Pokemon has never been grand. But this story, however, has always held a special place in my heart. And I thought there's no better time to dust it off and give it an old spin than right now. So, I figured, why not give it a shot? Roll the dice and who knows? Maybe I'll unlock the secret myself. This is number 3. Come follow me. During the first few days of the release of Pokemon Red and Green in Japan back in February of 1996, a peak of deaths appeared in the age groups of 10 to 15. The children were usually found dead through suicide, usually by hanging or jumping from heights. However, some were more odd. A few cases recorded children who had begun sawing off limbs, others sticking faces inside of ovens and choking themselves on their own fists, shoving their arms down their throats. The few children who were saved before this showed sporadic behavior, and when asked why they were going to hurt themselves, they only answered in chaotic screaming and scratched at their own eyes. When showed what seemed to be the connection to the attitude, the Game Boy, they had no response, but when combined with either Pokemon Red or Green, the screams would continue, and they would do their best to leave the room that it was located in. This confirmed the authorities' suspicion that the games, somehow, had a connection to the children and the deaths. It was a strange case, because many children who had the same games did not show this behavior. Only a select few. So, the police had no choice but to pursue this, since they had no other leads. Collecting all the cartridges these children had purchased, they kept them sealed away as strong evidence to look over later. They decided the first thing to do was to talk to the programmers themselves. The first person they met with was the director of the games, Satoshi Tajiri. When told about the deaths surrounding the games, he seemed slightly uneasy, but admitted nothing. He led them to the main programmers of the game, the people responsible for the actual content. The detectives met Takanori Iota, one of the main programmers of the game. Unlike Satoshi, he did not seem uneasy, but very kept, explaining that it was impossible to use something like a game to cause death, and also bringing up the point that not all the children were affected. He brushed it off as some kind of odd coincidence or mass hysteria. It seemed like he was hiding something, but he wasn't giving way if he was. But he finally did say something interesting. Takanori had heard a rumor going around that the music for Lavender Town, one of the locations in the game, had caused some children to go ill. It was only a rumor and had no real definite backup, but it was still something. He directed the detectives to Junichi Masuda, the music composer of the series. Masuda had also heard these rumors, but again said that they had no evidence that his music was the cause. Even to prove a point, he played the exact song from the game completely through with no effects to anyone. the detectives nor Masuda himself feeling anything different or odd. Although they still had their suspicions of Masuda and the music, it seemed they had reached another dead end. Going back to the actual cartridges they had seized from the homes of the children, they decided to take a slightly more direct look at the game. They knew that it was these games that gave the children the ill effects, so they took extreme caution. Popping in the cartridge and turning the consoles on, the game screen booted. The title screen appeared, and the option to continue or create a new game. When they chose to continue, stats of that game had appeared. They saw the names of the children who had played, usually Red or another simple name. However, the interesting thing was the time played and the number of Pokemon owned. On every game, the time was very low, and all of them had only a single Pokemon in their inventory. They came to the stunning reality that it could not have been the music from Lavender Town that had caused such ill effects in the children, since it was impossible to reach that part of the game in such small amounts of time, and with only one monster in their inventory. This brought them to the conclusion that something early on in the game had to be the cause. So if it wasn't the music, or the title screen, it had to be something within the first few minutes of the game itself. They had no choice but to turn off the game now and go back to the programmers. Asking for a complete list of all programmers from Takanori, they found, surprisingly, one of the programmers had committed suicide shortly after the game's release. Chiro Miura, a very obscure programmer who had provided very little for the game. Even more interestingly, he had requested his name not appear in the credits, and so it was not. Looking over the evidence found at Chiro's apartment, they found many notes written in bold markers, most of it crumbled or marked out, making it very difficult to read. The few words they could find in the mess were, "Do not enter," "Watch out," and "Come follow me," in bold. The detectives were unsure of what these meant, but knew they had to have a connection of something. Further searching, they discovered Chiro was good friends with one of the map designers, Koji Nishino, and this was probably the only reason that Chiro had given a part in making the game. Koji Nishino, since the release of the game, had locked himself in his apartment, barely leaving in the dark of night to fetch anything he might need. He told his friends and family that he was mourning for his dear friend, but they didn't believe this, since Nishino had locked himself up the day the game was put in stores. A few days before, Chiro had killed himself. It was troubling, but the authorities finally persuaded Nishino to sit down and speak with them. He looked as if he hadn't slept in days, dark rings under his eyes. He stunk, his nails had grown black, and his hair was greasy, sticking to his forehead and neck. He spoke in stutters and murmurs, but at least he had something to say. When asked if he knew anything about the children who had died after exposure of the game, and if it had any connection to it, he answered them seemingly carefully, choosing his words thoughtfully before answering. He told them his friend Chiro had an interesting idea of the game, something he had wanted to try since he heard the project was starting. Nishino himself knew Takanori, the director and main programmer, for a long time, so he could easily get a mediocre programmer in on the project with a little persuasion. It seemed Chiro had convinced Nishino to get him in on the project, and it had worked. The detectives knew that they were onto something. This unknown, obscure programmer had to have something to do with it. Something. They asked what Chiro's idea was, why he wanted so badly to have a part in making this children's game. Nishino told them that Chiro never told him much about it, other than a few details every now and then. He wanted to insert a special Pokemon in the game, one completely different from all the others. It would serve as an extra, an out-of-place thrill for the player, but it wasn't, however, missing. No, it couldn't be. With the gameplay time recording on the cartridges, it was impossible for the children to have time to have met something like that. Nicino, throughout the entire conversation, seemed to break down even more with every question. The detectives pushed him more and more, searching through his mind for any and every scrap of knowledge that the man had. It was when they asked him about the notes found in Chiro's home that he finally snapped. From under the couch Nicino was sitting on, he whipped out a pistol, pointed it at the police, and backed away a few steps, and then just as quickly brought it to his own face. "Don't. Follow me," muttered Nicino. It was too quick for the police to react. It was done. Nicino was dead, repeating slightly differently what was written on one of Chiro's papers. It seemed all leads had finally died. The team who had created the original game were splitting up, becoming harder to find. It was as if they were keeping a secret. When the police finally managed to talk with anyone who had parts in the game, even the obscure character designers or monster designers, it seemed that they had nothing of interest to say. Most of them didn't even know Chiro, and the few who did had only seen him once or twice working on the game itself. Throughout all of this, the only confirmation that they had was that Chiro was indeed the one who had worked on the very early parts of the game. It had been a couple of months after the original children's deaths, and the death rate had dropped dramatically. It seemed that the game was no longer giving any ill effects to children. The callback of the games that was planned was cancelled, since it seemed the game was no longer harming anyone. They had begun to think that maybe Takanori was right. This was all just a very odd coincidence or an instance of mass hysteria. Until they received a letter. It was given to one of the detectives himself, quite directly out on the street. It was a woman who gave him the note, a very frail, thin, sick-looking thing. She gave him the letter quickly, telling him that it was something that he needed to see, and without waiting for a response or another word, she disappeared into the crowd. The detective brought it to his office and called the others in. He brought it out and read it aloud. It was a letter written by Chiro himself, but it wasn't one found at his apartment. They had thoroughly searched and cleared out that. So wherever this letter had come from, it wasn't kept at his home. It was signed to be given to Nicino. It started off quite formal. A hello, a how are you, regards to the family and such. And after one or two of these normal paragraphs, they reached a section that requested Nicino to get him into the game team, to get him a programming position in Pokemon Red and Green. As the letter continued, the handwriting seemed to grow more jittery. He talked about a glorious idea he had, a way to program something unseen in any game before. He said it would certainly revolutionize not only the gaming industry, but everyone. He went on to say that it was a very simple procedure to program this idea into the game. He did not even have to add any foreign programming, but could use what was already given to the game itself. This would, the detectives agreed, make it impossible to notice any obscurities in the programming. It was a perfect way to hide whatever it was. The letter ended abruptly. No goodbye, no say hi to the family, no write back, or thank you. Nothing like that. It was just his name, written hard in the letter where the paper almost broke through. Chiro Miura. This was the nail in the coffin for the detectives. They had no more suspicion about the cause. Chiro had programmed something into the early parts of the game, something maddening. To further increase this streak of success, they discovered that the programming team had worked in pairs. Even Chiro himself. He had worked with another programmer, Sousuke Tamada. If anyone knew what the secret in this game was, Sousuke would be the one. This was their final hope of unraveling the mystery. They learned Sousuke had provided a lot of programming to the game, actually. Seemed to be an average good guy and worker. They were easily allowed into his home, a fair place, and they entered his living room where they sat. Sousuke did not sit, however. He stood by the window of the second-story floor, looking out onto the busy street. He was smiling a little. There is no direct witness to the events that follow. The only thing from this conversation that remains is found on the voice recorder sitting on the table in front of the two detectives assigned to talk to Sousuke. What follows is the recording. Sousuke Tamada, what part did you have in making the games? Asked the first detective. I'm just a programmer. His voice was light, friendly. Almost too much so. That is all. Am I right in knowing that the programmers worked on the game in teams? Asked the detective. One could hear the voice of feet moving around on the floor slightly. You would be right, said Sousuke after a moment of silence. And your partner, his name was? The detective was quickly cut off by Sousuke. Chiro Miura. That was his name. Chiro Miura. Another silence. It seemed the detectives were a little uneasy about him. Can you tell us if Miura ever acted strange? Any unusual behavior that you observed while working with him? Sousuke answered. No, I don't know him that well. Really. We didn't meet up frequently. Only every once in a while to trade data. Or when the entire group was called up for a meeting. That's the only times I ever really saw him. He acted normal as far as I could tell. He was a short man. I think this affected his consciousness. You know, he acted weaker than any other man that I met. He was willing to do a lot of work to gain recognition. That I do know. I think... Silence. Yes? Asked the detective, pushing him to continue. You think? I think he was a very weak man. I think he wanted to prove himself regardless of this point. I think he wanted to make himself known for something special. Something that would make people forget about the way he looked and pay attention to the powerful mind that lay inside. Unfortunately for him, however, they didn't have much of a mind to back up that reasoning. Why do you say that? Well, it's the simple truth. His feet could be heard moving across the tiled floor. He was nothing special. Even if you wanted to believe so, you can't become greatness. Even if you believe it, it's impossible. You know, somehow I think Chiro knew this himself. Somewhere deep in there, he knew it. The detectives were silent again, not sure how to steer the conversation, and after a moment they continued. Can you tell us what Chiro's part of the game was? What did he work on exactly? Nothing. I mean, nothing important. He worked on some obscure parts of the beginning. A pause, and then a little more. It was Oak's part, to be exact. He worked on some of Oak's parts. When he's first seen, you see. What else? They could hear it in Sousuke's voice. He knew something. We know you know about the children. And we know it was Chiro. What are you implying? We are implying that since you're his partner, if you are hiding anything from us, you are just as responsible as Chiro. You can't prove anything. Tell us what Chiro did to the game.
What I told him to.
You want to know, huh? You want to know what this is all about? Chiro was an idiot. He would do anything for a bit of attention, anything at all. He couldn't program worth a shit either. You want to know the one thing he could do? Must be manipulated. You could tell him what to do, and he'd do it. He wouldn't even question it. He'd just do it. Just to hear that thank you when you received the finished product. That was his reasons. That's all he wanted. You know, I could control him flawlessly. He's a lot like Takanori. Of course, none of you know this, but I'm the one who brought up the idea of the game. The idea of the whole operation. I just told the fellow what to do, and he just followed me. Without doubt. He knows nothing. Just like Chiro. The sound of a window opening could be heard, followed by the detectives. Sasuke, don't move. Let me tell you about a mechanic in the game. Continued Sasuke. His voice was more rushed, but it still held that slyness. Consider it a hint, okay? If you walk around enough in grassy areas, Pokemon will appear, and you have a chance to go into battle. It's a necessary part of the game, you see. Step away from the window. We won't warn you again. And at the start you have to walk in before Oak appears, and that's when you receive your first Pokemon. You understand me? Under normal circumstances, it's programmed that even though you're in a grassy area, nothing will spawn. You see, I made it different. I manipulated that idiot. I told him what to put in the program. I gave him all the instructions on how to do it, and he did it. Somehow, he did it flawlessly. It's rare, but it can happen. Stepping in to the grass, one can spawn. Sasuke, we don't want to shoot. Shoot! Shoot! Shoot me? Shoot me! Go on, shoot me. You're just as dumb as he was. You see, once he found out what I did, well, he had to do what he did. It was his fault after all. You see, he's dead because of it. If you're so determined to finish that case of yours, if you really want to know, play the damn game for yourself. You do have them, after all, so roll the wheel, and who knows? Maybe you'll learn the secret for yourself. A shot can be heard loud enough to distort the audio. Sounds of screaming, murmuring, and the table that the recorder was on crashing. Ear-shattering distortions, silence, and then laughing. Sasuke, laughing. And then,
Come follow me. Come follow me.
and then nothing. The recorder continued to record until the tape ran out. There was nothing else on it. The police arrived at the scene quickly, and to their horror, and discovered Sasuke and the two detectives dead. They had all shot each other, but not after struggling. The detectives had been shot multiple times, at least 10 each, before dying, each being shot in between the eyes. Sasuke himself clearly died of 2 shots to his chest, straight through the heart. The game had caused quite the massacre. At least 100 children, Nacino, the unsuspecting friend, dead, Chiro, the manipulated toy, dead, the 2 detectives dead, and now, even the creator, the cause of the atrocity, Sasuke, dead. The game was stretching far over its original intentions. The lead detective had decided to put the case away. The man who committed the crime was dead, and there was no longer any reason to continue the case. All evidence, all the cartridges, all the notes, all the letters, locked away, kept in the darkness where they belonged. There were talks about the entire thing, small conversations every now and then, but over the years, even these began to fade away. Eventually, the case is only a memory in the minds of those who experienced it. And then 10 years passed. February 27th, 2006. The lead detective, the man who had locked away the original evidence, was reminded of the event. And although he was no longer in the force, he still had access to files and was helped when he could. The reminder of the event caused him to look back to open the sealed container that held the evidence collected. He read through the letters and the notes one more time, remembered the woman who had appeared to him on the street that one day, and handed him that letter that led to the change of the case. He wondered who she was and where she had come from. Perhaps she was Chiro's mother, or perhaps Sasuke's. It was far too late to pursue any of that, though. Far too late. Sealing the container again, he saw a second one directly behind it. Pulling it out, he read the note on top. Evidence number 2104A. He opened it up and looked inside. Filling the container were 104 Pokemon Red and Green cartridges, each one in perfect condition, untouched since the day they had last checked them in 10 years ago. He reached in and pulled one out. Pokemon Red. He hadn't seen one in a long time. He didn't know what he thought next, but he reached in his desk and pulled out the old Game Boy. He had received it a long time ago, but it still worked. It was his son's, but he had died a few years ago. His wife, too. That was then, though. Popping in the cartridge in the back of the Game Boy, he turned on the system. The title screen, and then the option to continue or start a new game. Tanaka. That was the child's name, the one who had played it first. Most likely dead, along with all the others. He pressed New Game and started a new one. It was normal, average. He walked around, talked to his mother, went outside, and started walking toward the grass. In his head, he could hear Sasuke's words, even though he was not there that day, even though he had never seen the man in his life. He could still see him, hear him. Come follow me. He was getting closer and closer, only a step or two away. Roll the wheel, and who knows? Maybe you'll learn the secret for yourself. He entered the grass. The screen did nothing at first, nothing at all. It just sat there. And so did the detective. completely frozen, as if time had stopped just for them. The screen went black and then lit up again. The iconic green background with black text appearing. The lead detective's weary eyes grew wide, and he couldn't help but read out what was there in front of him. "Come follow me. Come follow me. Come follow me. I miss you, Dad. I miss you, my husband. We miss you so much." Screens and screens of text appeared, and he rapidly clicked the A button to continue it. They were speaking to him, calling to him, crying with him. They wanted to see him. They loved him. Come follow me. Become new again. We want to see you and hold you and be with you forever and ever and ever and ever and ever. Don't stay away. You can see us too. We miss you. Come follow me. We love you. A black screen. The detective's eyes grew wide, his jaw dropping. The screen lit back up again, and Oak was leading him out of the grass. "Come follow me," said Oak. "No," shouted the man, dropping the game onto the floor. He fell forward, reaching for it, bringing the screen back to his face. "Bring them back. Bring them back to me." The game continued on as usual, now not responding to the detective at all. Voices. He heard voices, hundreds of voices. He turned around from his seat, looking behind him. And standing in his small room were children, so many children. Some had no eyes, some had rings around their throats, some were burned, and they were all screaming, reaching toward him. "Bring back my mom. Bring back my dad. Bring back my pet." They screamed at him, reaching for the game, mouths agape with horror. "I don't want them to go away. Bring them back. Bring them back. Come follow me," said a voice. The lead detective turned around, and in the corner of the room, next to a desk, was Sasuke. He stood in the corner, tall, handsome, and clean. A smile was on his face, stretching across it. "Come follow me." The lead detective jumped up, stepping back, trying to force away the children crawling towards him, reaching out for the game held tightly within his hands. "What's going on? Where's my family?" Sasuke smiled. "I'll show you. I'll help you get away from them, you see. Just follow me." Sasuke reached down and opened a drawer on the old desk. The lead detective, pushing through the crowd of children, trying to get away, looked inside. Sitting there covered with dust was an old gun from when he was on the force. He had not used the gun in many years, and had put it away, not wanting to remember the things he had to do with it. But right now, he didn't see it as something that had caused pain or that killed. It was shining. It was a light. Something that could set him free. Just come follow me, said Sasuke, picking up the gun and putting it in his hands. He formed his hand to hold the gun and then brought it to his temple. Just come follow me. The lead detective turned around. The children had stopped crawling at him, stopped grabbing his legs and pulling at him, but they still reached for the game. He turned back towards Sasuke and smiled. I'll follow you. His brain spread the wall as he fell to the ground. It was a few days before his body was discovered. It lay on the floor, blood pooling. In one hand held an empty gun, and in the other a classic Game Boy with one of the confiscated cartridges. The battery had long died, and only an empty black screen was left. This was the final murder that the remaining authorities allowed. The last detective who was ever a part of this case personally carried the remaining 104 cartridges away and burned them, making sure not a single one survived. They would taunt no more. However, this is not the end of the story. The code was said to have survived and was even passed on to other language versions of the game. If you have an old Pokemon game, you can place the cartridge in the back of the classic Game Boy, turn on the system, and roll the wheel. Who knows? Maybe you'll learn the secret for yourself.